There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday read. I've had a great week, not particularly eventful. The most eventful thing that happened, I think, two things, I guess. I went out for a day trip to the farm. The whole family gathered there to do some sorting out of things and getting things ready for winter. And that was just a day trip, and that was lovely. And I had a vaccination yesterday that whew, knocked me for a loop. Not yesterday, the day before. It was part 2, the second shot for the shingles vaccination, which did a real number on me. So it kind of put a cramp in my style for a day and a half, but I think I'm back to normal, or as Joe Smith would put it, compos mentis. She said, I hope you're compos mentis by now, because I sure wasn't when I checked in on our buddy read earlier yesterday. Anyway, those are my wee personal updates. So without further ado, oh my god, well, I am only inviting very exciting mystery guests, and this one is very exciting indeed. Let's meet this person. And this week's mystery guest is the preeminent literary biographer and writer, Peter Parker, joining us from London. Peter Parker, what an honor to have you on my channel.
Well, thank you for having me, Sean. It's a great pleasure to be here.
My goodness. So Peter Parker's been on my radar since I acquired a copy that I'm embarrassed to say I have not yet read of his second book, his biography of J.R. Ackerley. Ackerley, The Life of J.R. Ackerley. I have a gorgeous edition of it. I'm a big fan of Ackerley. I've been following Peter on Twitter ever since. And so Peter has latest project, or knowing him, I don't claim to know him, but I'm just imagining he's probably onto something else by now. But his publishing this year is a series of books called Some Men in London. And Peter, tell us about this series.
Well, it's 2 books. People keep saying, when's volume 3 coming? 2 is quite enough. It was conceived as 1 book. And what it is, it's an anthology of all kinds of things describing queer life in London from 1945 right up to the passing of the Sexual Offences Act in 1967, which partially decriminalised homosexuality in the UK, or rather actually not in the UK, only in England and Wales. Scotland and Northern Ireland had to wait a bit. But it was an idea that was put to me by Penguin. And I thought, oh, well, this sounds a really interesting sort of side project I could be doing while doing something else. But needless to say, it entirely took over my life for 6 years. And what I've done, it's arranged chronologically. So it starts on VE night in 1945 with 2 contrasting diary entries, one of a physique photographer called John Barrington, who was out on the streets celebrating and picking up sailors, and the other, the Conservative MP Chips Channon, who was having a party for the great and the good in his very grand house in Belgravia. And I like those sort of juxtapositions which happen, I hope, throughout the book. So it's arranged chronologically, and obviously we're moving towards the point where homosexuality is going to be partially decriminalised. But it starts in 1945 really because after the war in this country, there was a moral panic that men had been away at war, their children were going off the rails, there was a rise in hooliganism, and there was supposedly a rise in homosexuality. And this was threatening family life because, as we all know, all gay men need a parental hand from the father. And if they're left in charge of their mother, they'll become screaming queens. So homosexuality, having been a taboo subject, really never mentioned in polite company, suddenly became this hot topic. And the sort of pivotal moment was when the government decided to appoint a committee, a parliamentary committee, to look into the law governing homosexuality and, in fact, at the same time, female prostitution. And it probably says quite a lot about attitudes that those 2 were bracketed. And that was headed by a man called Sir John Wolfenden, who was an educationalist. And he was appointed in 1953, and his report was eventually published in 1957, and astonishingly became a bestseller, which is not something that usually happens to parliamentary reports, certainly not in this country. And so from then on, for the rest of the 50s, right through up until the point the act was passed to decriminalise homosexuality, it was a topic much discussed, not only in Parliament, but on radio, on television, in newspapers, and of course in people's diaries, in their letters, in psychiatric reports, in police reports, in all manner of both private and public discourse. And what I've done is I've brought all these together to make what I hope is a coherent whole. It wasn't really until I published, the book actually came out, that I realized quite what it was. You know, one's always, in any book, you're slightly fumbling around in the dark and you never quite know what's going to emerge. And I realize now that this, particularly the first volume, which goes from 1945 up to 1959, is really in this country a forgotten era. And now we have so many gay rights here, you know, that you can marry someone of the same gender. You know, I think the people in the 50s would be absolutely astonished that this could be the case. But I think we always need to remember that these rights that we all enjoy just didn't happen. You know, people fought for them. So it's partly the story of that battle, but it's also full of, I hope, a good deal of humor, because gay men, you know, under pressure, you know, they showed extraordinary resilience, and much of that was through humor, often of a dark kind. So in amongst the tragic news stories of blackmail and suicide and murder and general ostracism, there are also a lot of material about people actually having a good time. I mean, someone said to me after the first book was published, I had absolutely no idea men had gay clubs and pubs in the 1950s. You know, I'm astonished that they were actually having quite a good time, or some of them were.
Weird joy, what a concept.
Yes, yes. But of course, you can imagine it took some putting together. You know, you can accumulate all this material, but then what do you do with it?
And the material that you have put together, is it a mix of previously unpublished and published stuff, or how did you make those kinds of choices?
Yeah, it's a mixture. So things like parliamentary reports, they are published here as they happen. So they're on record. But some of the police reports and police records, they exist, but they're not on the whole published. They're in, you know, you can access them, but there aren't necessarily books of them. Some of the diaries that I draw upon by gay men, some are published, some are not published. Obviously, I draw on novels and poems that are published, and plays that were performed, and films that were shown in the cinema. But at the same time, there are all sorts of police files, psychiatric reports, things like this that weren't in the public domain, but I've now brought into the public domain.
So you have answered the next question I was going to ask, which was whether there was fictional excerpts of fiction in this, and it sounds like there very much is, which is great. And also, I'm picking up that the stories that you include here that come from a wide variety of sources, they're not only about famous gay men.
Oh, yes. No, I was very determined to, you know, they're all in there. You know, John Gielgud is in there, and Terence Rattigan and Angus Wilson, various novelists and very famous politicians who got into trouble or who argued for or against decriminalization. So there are those, but I particularly wanted to get in voices that are not generally heard, which is quite difficult because by and large, gay history, it's usually written by, you know, the middle and upper classes who had the resources to, whereas getting the voices of gay men from the working class or black voices. I should actually say there are no, the book doesn't deal with lesbians, but that's simply because lesbianism in this country has never been criminalized. And since the story is going towards decriminalization, also it would have made the book even larger than it is. It's quite large enough just with the men. But trying to get in these other voices was one of the bigger challenges. And often you're actually going to middle class people who've had relations with working class people, and getting the voices of the men they were having relationships is quite tricky. But there was this ridiculous idea, which is one of the things I really wanted to disprove, that homosexuality in this country was some upper class decadent affectation, and that no working class man would indulge in homosexual practices unless corrupted by his social betters. if you only go to the court records, and you see in a lot of the court records, they actually give the job of the person who's accused. And by and large, of course, there are plenty of teachers, clergymen, actors, and so on. But actually, they are far outnumbered by, plumbers, carpenters, factory workers, hotel and domestic staff. So that was one of the myths that I wanted to expose. I'm not the first person to do it, I should say, but it seemed to me important to emphasize that this was widespread throughout society, like a disease, as a lot of MPs thought.
Volume 1 came out at the end of May this year, and in a few days, maybe in about a week from when this video goes live, Volume 2 will come out. So give us a sense of what Volume 2, the social forces that shape the experience of gay men in that period, that later period.
Yes. Well, that's another of the myths I wanted to expose, because, the swinging 60s where everything, everybody was having sex all over the place, sexual freedom that was brought in with the introduction of the contraceptive pill and social attitudes changing. But of course, until 1967, everybody else may have been having it away, but gay men could still be prosecuted and indeed imprisoned for doing basically what all the heterosexuals were doing. And one of the odd things is that it's often said that swinging London was actually invented by 3 gay men. Christopher Gibbs, the sort of interior designer and sort of style guru. There was Robert Fraser, who was a gallerist who promoted pop art, and John Stevens, who was a fashion designer. And these 3 men were all often said that they created swinging 60s. But of course, they could all have been sent to jail. So although the 60s did swing and they had a great influence on it, it isn't quite the sunny uplands. I think people will think, oh, Volume 1, we know that the 50s were depressing and, post-war rationing still going on for much of it, and the age of austerity. And then, oh, hurrah, we've arrived in 1960 and we're all going to let it all hang out. Well, actually, it isn't like that. Things were better. And also, I think homosexuality became more visible, or people didn't care quite so much. So a lot of the fashions, for example, the post-war very masculine styles that men wore were being abandoned for the more Carnaby Street boutique look with floral patterns, and all the pop stars were wearing much and growing their hair long. So that sort of introduction of androgyny also suggested a certain amount of sexual ambivalence, even though, in fact, a lot of the pop stars were entirely heterosexual, but they sort of didn't look it. And those sort of things do have an influence on public opinion.
Did immersing yourself in this project change your perspective on life as a gay man in the year 2024 or 2023?
I think I realized how lucky I was. I'm not sure it changed my perspective, partly because I think one of the reasons I was asked to do this book is that I'd written a biography of J.R. Ackerley, you mentioned, and I'd written a biography of Christopher Isherwood. So I'd explored the sort of the 30s, 40s, 50s. They were things I'd written about gay men during that period. So it was something I knew a lot about. And, if you're known to be a gay writer, if you're reviewing books, you're often sent books of gay interest. And I started out as a reviewer working for the Old Gay News, which was a newspaper in the UK, which had its own literary supplement. So, my shelves were already laden with books on the topic. I think I was surprised by some things. I was absolutely deeply shocked. I'm not easily shockable, but I was fairly shocked, particularly by the medical community, the sort of things that psychiatrists and doctors came out with. You would think if you were a psychiatrist specializing in homosexuality, you would have some idea of what it was. And there are all these people saying, oh yes, there are all these cures we can do, and they ought to be cured. And some of those really shocked me. And in fact, the end of Volume 1, the very final extract, which just happened to be published in December 1959, so it absolutely came as the last entry, is a court report, which is just so shocking. And I will give it away. A young man is up in court accused of assault on a woman and attempted rape of another woman. And often in these cases, a professional psychiatrist was brought in to sort of, as it were, mitigate or explain or say something about the character of the person who was on trial. And this psychiatrist said, well, before these offences took place, this young man was homosexual. So you could say this is a step in the right direction. And I've said this to other people and they all gasp because it just seems so extraordinary. It would be bad enough if some newspaper editorial said it of a right-wing press, but actually for a professional psychiatrist in court to say something like that is truly shocking. I knew that the police didn't behave very well here, but the amount of sort of their attitudes, their saying that they never used agent provocateur where they clearly did, that was shocking. I suppose the message, or one of the messages I would like people to take away from this book, is that we have all these rights now, but they didn't just appear. People fought for them, and a lot of those people are not at all household names and barely remembered even by gay men. And I think particularly young gay people who are growing up with these rights, will be shocked by some of the things that people said in this book and some of the attitudes. But for example, someone like A.E. Dyson, who was an academic who founded the Homosexual Law Reform Society, which was trying to persuade the government to act on the Wolfenden Committee's recommendation that homosexuality should be partially legalized. But Parliament dragged its heels, and he got the great and good to sign letters, and he fought for it. But he's a man who's, I would think, except in a small circle, is entirely forgotten. And I think these people, we need to remember that without them, where would we be? We might be back in the dark ages of some other countries in the world where homosexual is still illegal and punishable and completely not accepted. So we're very lucky.
When you go walk around your city, London, after having completed this project, does it color your feeling of the queer history that you're walking through?
I think it does, partly because, though it's not in the book, while writing it, I compiled a gazetteer of gay places in London and all these old pubs and clubs, a lot of which are now, famously the Salisbury pub, which is in central London and was used in the film Victim, this 1961 film with Dirk Bogarde playing a married barrister, and he's exposing a ring of blackmailers who are blackmailing gay men. It's all shot on London locations, and it was sort of pioneering, in fact, quite proselytizing film about how bad the law was. And the Salisbury, I remember when I came to London as a student, was still a gay pub. It isn't any longer. So you sort of see those changes, and then you go past pubs with rainbow flags and people standing outside, and it all seems very different. But I've always been interested, as someone who was not born in London history, and also these layers of history that you get where places go in and out of fashion or in and out of popularity, which they did during the period even I'm writing about, because if the police raided a pub or a club, or a pub in particular, what usually happened was that the clientele that weren't actually arrested would just find another pub, and that would become a gay pub. So I find that those sort of layers of history and the changing aspects of individual buildings even very interesting. And also that sort of hidden history of you walk past a house and suddenly think, oh, that's where, Francis Bacon lived, some famous painter or famous writer, or that's where Peter Wildeblood lived. I went past his house a few months ago, and I suddenly thought, oh, he lived on this street, and he was the man who was arrested and wrote a very famous book called Against the Law about being arrested for homosexuality. And so you get this idea of London is constantly changing, like most cities, of course.
It's a little anecdote about myself. When I was about 21 in the late 80s or mid to late 80s, this young gay man from the prairies of Canada went and did a student work abroad program in London. And read my heart out. I was on the tube every day to go to work, and I read so many books that year, and one of them was Prick Up Your Ears, the biography of Joe Orton by John Lahr.
Yes.
And then later that summer, I was in a gay bar, I went into the bathroom and there was a plaque on the wall that said, Joe Orton had sex here.
Very nice. Well, it has to be said that there were rather a lot of places that that plaque might have been put up. And actually, there's quite a bit of Joe Orton in volume 2. I've got an extract from his play Entertaining Mr. Sloane, which is 1964, and is astonishingly explicit. There's a wonderful scene between the older man and the young man who's coming to be a lodger, and he's sort of saying, like, do you like wearing leather next to your skin? And I hope you're not too interested in girls, and you do work out a lot. And it's just very, very funny. And then later on, of course, we get the diaries that have been published about him going to various lavatories and having sex all over the place. And also Orton, for his period, which is, he was killed in 1967. So he died just shortly after, as it were, he was legalized. His diaries are astonishingly frank about his sexuality, and he just was not in the least bit ashamed of it, or he felt no inhibitions about his sexuality. So it's very nice to get those voices, because of course there are a lot of people who are, making excuses. I don't mean they're excusing their sexuality, but they're clearly not absolutely comfortable about it, as who would be if you were liable to blackmail or imprisonment for it. So he's a refreshing voice, but there are others. The British painter Keith Vaughan wrote these fantastic diaries, some of which have been published, but only a very small portion, and I've got some of the published and some of the unpublished. And he, again, is very introspective. I mean, a much more depressive character than Orton. And then James Courage, a wonderful New Zealand writer who's virtually unknown outside his country, but somebody edited his diaries about 2 years ago, where he was living in London, and they're marvelous. But again, he was a depressive. He was in therapy the whole time. But very touching. He wrote a book called A Way of Love, which is a pioneering early novel about the gay experience, but written sort of not in shock horror terms, but absolutely, straightforward.
I've never heard of him or that book, so that is, I'm going to hunt that one down. I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll ask you anyway. Why are you not going to be continuing the series? My guess would be that from 1967 on, it's so well documented and blah, 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 that there wasn't a need to continue the series past 67. Would that be right?
I think that's partly it. It's partly that the law changed, though in fact prosecutions in London went up because the police then went after crimes that were still on the statute book. So in other words, the law was changed so that it was 2 consenting adults in private. So if you weren't in private, if you were cruising in a park or a lavatory or something, it was still a crime. And if either of you were under 21, it was still a crime. There is a shift, of course. When we get to the 70s, you get the gay liberation movement, the campaign for homosexual equality, and the atmosphere entirely changes, and it becomes, you are, or if you're lucky enough to be the right age, you're legal and living in the right country, you're legal, but you actually want the sort of rights that we all have now. Also, in my period, if you wanted to change things, you wrote letters to the Times newspaper, it was signed. Later on, people went on marches, and I'm old enough to have come to university for the 70s. So I was on those marches. So one of the reasons I don't want to write about it is it's not to me history. It's part of my life. And I just find, it sounds slightly perverse to say that I find the sort of the illegal and furtive and defiant era actually more interesting. I think it is more interesting. And it is also because it's not as well known. You're right that the gay movement onwards, when it became gay rather than queer as it was, is much better documented. And I'm just interested in these people who had to live lives undercover. It's a more interesting narrative, I think. I'm not saying it's better. Obviously, it's much better that people were able to go out in the streets and march and have a much freer life. But the earlier period is what interests me. Actually, one of my real periods of more expertise possibly is the sort of 20s and 30s. So if there ever was another volume, it would be that period rather than the other. But no, I'm not going there.
Peter, would you ever consider writing a memoir?
Well, I judge every year a prize for memoir, and I've read so many memoirs that I feel there are more than enough. I mean, it's a possibility, but not at the moment anyway.
What about fiction?
No, I started off writing short stories, some of which were published, and then my first book was about the First World War, and then it's always been non-fiction. I think I've read so many gay novels, or I mean, so many novels generally. I think, I'm not sure it's not my strength, I think.
I won't debate that with you, but you have put out a lot of amazing scholarship and biography out into the world. Can I ask for 1 minute on your gardening book?
Oh,
A
yes,
little book of Latin for gardeners.
That's the wild card. Yes, I sort of got away from the First World War and gay writers to write that. That was partly, it was just, I'm a very keen gardener, and I used to write regularly for a gardening magazine, a quarterly here called Hortus, which is actually read worldwide. And I just wrote 2 articles about, one about English plant names and one about Latin plant names. And then I was asked by my publisher to come up with 5 ideas for a short book. And this was one of them. And I just threw it in as a wild card. And to my astonishment, both the publisher and my agent said, that's the one. So there, and I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. And it's sold better than any of my other books. It's been a rather a success. I'm rather pleased with it.
So, Peter Parker, the reader, what would you like to recommend that you've been reading?
Well, this year I've been rereading all of Ian Forster's books, partly because I wrote a piece about the centenary of A Passage to India for the Times Literary Supplement, a long piece about that. And I've also been asked to, in about a fortnight's time, to do a lecture on Ian Forster. So I've been rereading Ian Forster, but also this is the volume of Forster's short stories, and it's just come out.
I've read it.
Yeah, and it's just come out in a new edition from Penguin Classics with an introduction by Dermot Hester, who's a very good writer, who in fact interviewed me about my 2 books. And it's absolutely fascinating. So that is what I'm reading. And I'm also reading, rather more slowly, this huge book, very detailed book on W.H. Auden, written by a British writer called Nicholas Jenkins, who lives in America. And he's been working on it even longer than I worked on the Isherwood biography, which is saying something. And it's finally come out. And it's a very detailed analysis of Auden's early years in Britain before he emigrated to the States. Absolutely wonderful. So I recommend that. And then if I'm talking about favourite books, Shirley Hazzard, I think this is just such a wonderful book.
I've heard nothing but good about it.
She's such a brilliant writer. And this is the most extraordinary, The Transit of Venus, which I've read many times. And it's partly because it's so clever, because it shows the last pages. I think a lot of people read it and they don't actually know what's happened, because what has happened has been prefigured, but you have to read it very, very carefully. And as the narrative skill, also, I mean, she just writes beautifully. She's just a wonderful writer. I've read all her books. That's my favorite, though you could say it's slightly flawed compared to some of the other books, but it's the one I love the most.
I looked up your review, Peter, of the love letters of Denton Welch. It was called Good Night, Beloved Comrade, edited by Daniel Murtaugh, and I couldn't agree more with your review. That book turned me off of Denton Welch, who had been, I thought, a candidate for one of my all-time favorite writers. I just didn't like reading those
Well,
letters.
I'm so delighted, because Denton Welch is one of my absolute favourite writers, and I have managed to get an extract from one of his short stories into volume 1. And we cut a lot of fiction, but happily my editor at Penguin is also a fan of Denton Welch. So Denton was saved where other much better known writers went to the wall. Yes, I think, there are often writers who are not at their best in letters. Some writers write brilliant letters. Others are not good. I mean, I would say Elizabeth Bowen is another example. There was a volume of her letters to one of her lovers. And, I thought she was undone by love, and it showed, and even her language was undone. I mean, she's the most brilliant writer. And actually, when she came to writing love letters, they were just slightly disappointing. They were a bit more banal, and, it doesn't make me think any less of her, either as a person or as a writer. But I think it's often the case that we think we want to know everything about, we want to have everything published. Isherwood, who I wrote a book about, always said that he was not a good letter writer and he was really a diarist, which may be true. I mean, the diaries have been published, letters are forthcoming, but I've read many of them. And I wouldn't necessarily agree. But it's one of those things, we all want to know everything about writers we love. And we all want this material. And just sometimes you think, it's like rereading a book you loved much earlier and you reread it again and it's a disappointment. You think, oh, why did I read it again? Why don't I just remember how much I loved it when I first read it?
Well, I think enough time has passed that I'll be ready to go back to Denton Welch's fiction. I have only read 2, and they just were transformative reads. Let's see. I did In Youth's Pleasure first, and then went on to A Voice of the Cloud, and just was bowled away by them.
I've read every published word he's written.
I'm sure you have.
A fantastic boxed edition of 2 volumes, very expensive and impossible to get hold of now, that had all the short stories and sort of extracts from his diary.
I have it on my shelf. Yes.
Brilliant. Well done. The one Where Nothing Sleeps.
Yeah.
Is it?
I don't know how I'm going to read it. It's so bloody heavy. Each volume is so heavy.
Yeah, but it you were very wise to buy it, because now it goes for some phenomenal amount. It was done by a small press that needed a limited edition. Yeah, that's right, Tartarus Press. A wonderful, beautiful edition. And I was so pleased to get that. Yes, yeah, very good.
It wasn't cheap to buy when you could buy it. And so I'm sure it's really pricey now. So yes, it's pride of place on my shelf. And have you read it?
Yeah, I have. I've read it all the way through.
Right. Oh.
Highly recommend it.
Did you get how did you hold it? Did you put it on the table?
Yes, it wasn't a book to read in bed, but that's what people said about my Isherwood biography. I got lots of complaints from elderly gay men saying it was too heavy to hold up in bed.
Some Men in London is not it's
not light.
They're not light either.
No.
But I can't wait to get into them, and I would love to have you come back and talk more about all these issues if you would be willing. But what an incredible conversation. Thank you so much, Peter Parker.
Thank you for having me.
What an honor to have Peter Parker on my channel. All right, so this week on BookTube, I got one video out. I had a book call up the other day. I have another episode of Zooming In almost ready to post, so stay tuned for that. But that's what I managed to do this week. I finished 2 books. One is the latest David Carpenter that I read to my dear friend and cousin Mary Jean, Welcome to Canada stories. And I think it's my favorite of all that I've read by him. Solid 5-star read. I can't wait to interview him about it in the coming weeks. The video will come to you sometime in 2025, but this was I guess it's kind of like a selected stories. Many, if not all of these, were previously published, but all but 2 of them were new to me and reflected a mature David Carpenter style and storytelling that I just loved. His female characters are so 3-dimensional, and many of the stories he tells are very masculine. So I read a lot about fishing and hunting in here, and he made it interesting to me. So hats off to David Carpenter. And lots of bears and deer and so on. Interestingly, 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, I'm not sure how recently, somewhat recently, David Carpenter has renounced hunting and no longer hunts, and he wrote a memoir about that, which I look forward to reading. And it'll be interesting to talk to him about these hunting stories, which are very much, I was going to say that the wild animals here are imbued with humanity, but that's a stupid thing to say. I think you know what I mean, but there is a respect and nuance to the way the humans think about the animals and the way the animals are portrayed that was really quite striking. So I think that this book of short stories would be a very fitting welcome to Canada for anyone outside Canada, and also I think would deepen many a Canadian's connection to their own land. So without meaning that it's a patriotic fiction, good Lord, gag me with a spoon, but entertaining, sometimes very funny, and very deeply told Canadian tales. Just this morning I finished Invitation to the Waltz by Rosamond Lehmann. It's her 3rd novel, 1932. This was very different from anything else I'd read by her, and it was a triumph for me as a reader. It was very deeply affecting. The protagonist is Olivia, set in around 1930s or 20s, and she wakes up on her 17th birthday and gets presents from her family, and we get to really meet her family and some neighbors and a servant woman who does the sewing, because there's a big dance down the street or up the road. They're really kind of in countryside Britain. And she's all keyed up about it. But we get really immersed in her family life for the first maybe 2 or 3 chapters. And then a son of one of her mother's friends or someone comes to call. Both she and her older sister Kate, who's maybe 19 or something, are all aflutter about this new young man who's coming, that they don't, maybe they remember him from 10 years ago or something, but hoping he's really handsome and hot and that they're going to the dance with him. The dance is at the lord and lady down the road, the noble couple of the area. And the guy shows up and he's a dweeb. And they're very disappointed. But still hoping there might be some people. Well, Kate, the older sister, she knows there's going to be some people. She's interested in some young men, but Olivia is all aflutter and hoping. Before they even get out of the house, I just was so in love with her, this 17-year-old with all the typical adolescent anxieties and angst and worries about how she looked and whether her dress was fitting just so. While at the same time, and then deepening over the course of the rest of the novel, a capacious vastness to her character. I won't be surprised to find out if it's true. She's a doppelganger for the author, because she sees the world and experiences the world amidst all of that very relatable anxiety that all teenage girls, including me, have. And she just has this enlarged vision, and she just takes people in. And the rest of the novel is at the dance. And every chapter, basically, is her having a dance with one new young man. It's not quite that neat, but that's mostly what you get for the rest of the novel. And if you are not a character reader, I think you would find it a little bit light. And I was worried for maybe a chapter or two. I thought, is this really going to be all about the dance and who she likes and who she doesn't? And it didn't take me more than another couple pages to realize, oh, she's up to something really deep and wonderful here. So by the end of the dance, I would have married her. She was just so wonderful, and she just went through so many awakenings. And I think I'm probably overusing the word profound, but bear with me. Profound moments of self-awareness where you just know she is so vulnerable to other people, and she realizes that, and I'm gonna be worried about her every time I think about this novel, because as she goes through life, she's going to be severely wounded by people. She's very impressionable, but she also has a sense of curiosity, is way too weak of a word, but she just has a sense of everything around her and happening in her that I think is the soul of a writer. Oh, it was just gorgeous. It distills everything that I look for in character work in literary fiction. If you're not particularly a literary fiction kind of reader, I don't know why you're watching me if you're not. If you're more of a plot-driven reader than a character-driven reader, I would give this a miss. But if you haven't excluded yourself from those last 2 phrases, rush out and read this, because this was literary gold for me. I'm a ways into the books I told you last week I would be starting, and so here's very passionate preliminary check-ins on both of them. Both of them are new Irish novels this year. The first that I'll talk about is The Inheritance by Cauvery Madhavan, and I've read about 40 pages of it, and I am a smitten kitten. The story is set in the area of Ireland where Cauvery Madhavan and her family live, on the Beara Peninsula, which is on the southwest coast of Ireland. I'm reading off Wikipedia here, between the Kenmare River to the north and Bantry Bay to the south. And any interview that I've ever had with Cauvery on my channel, she's talked about the Bantry Bay, and it's already showing up in this story. So that's the setting. And a young man, I think he might be around late 20s or around 30, his mother is from this part of Ireland. I think the nearest town might be Glengariff. And he's come to live in his, what's the adjective? Priestly uncles, two Catholic priests. And then when the last one died, it was left to their nephew, Marlowe. He had grown up in London. His mother moved to London with his father before his birth. It's not clear, and it's devilishly mysterious to me, why he picked up and left London to come here. And that's all going to come out in the wash. But he is just enthralled with his new natural surroundings. So he's living in this house where his two elderly uncles, who were both Catholic priests, lived, and he's settling in, meeting the neighbors, and the neighbors all remember his mother very well. The other thing that I should say, and this is not a spoiler because it's literally the first sentence of the novel, is he finds out, and it's set in 1986, April. It all began the day he found out that his sister was his mother. So he finds out that the sister he was raised with was actually his mother, and he was raised by his grandmother. And I don't know if that's exactly what, or solely what triggered him to leave, but anyway, so he goes, this family secret, he doesn't breathe a word of it to the old friends of his mother's that he's living amidst, but he's just discovering the neighborhood, discovering the beauty of it, and the other fascinating thing about him so far is he is writing a newspaper column for a newspaper in, I believe it's Butte, Montana. I remember it's Montana. I think it's Butte, Montana, about life in this part of Ireland. And it's not enough quite to pay the bills, but it's what he's got for work and how he got it or why he's doing that. But so he's a writer. This novel absolutely sparkles. I just have fallen into it. I can't wait to keep reading, and I'm dying to chat with Cauvery about it. So it's starting out sparklingly. Now, I have to say, I always take a big risk when I make a plan to interview a writer about their work, whether they've been on my channel or not, before I've read the book, because what if I don't like the book? So how overjoyed am I that both of the novels by these two Irish writers, both of whom have been on my channel umpteen times, are starting out sparklingly. So I'm a ways now into Ghost Mountain by Rónán Hession, and I think he's outdone himself based on the first several chapters. These are short chapters, and this is a very unusual story with a gorgeous cover. It's set in a I guess it's a town, maybe a city. Interestingly, Rónán Hession, unless I'm forgetting something about his middle novel, Paninka, none of his fiction is geographically situated, but this is set in a place with some very quirky and deeply fascinating characters, and the premise is that all of a sudden there's a new mountain in town, or on the side of town, and boy, does that sound like something that Sean the Bookmaniac, I can talk about him in the past, would bristle at and probably put the book down. A mountain just suddenly appears? What are we talking about? Is this a cartoon? I have matured as a reader, absolutely. But this story is opening in a really beguiling way. You don't have to even suspend disbelief. You just fall into this world. So the characters are unforgettable. The main characters are Ocho. I'll have to ask Rónán how to pronounce his name. And he's a bit of a insecure young soul. His wife Ruth thinks of him as a young soul. And so he's never quite sure where he stands with his wife. Whereas Ruth is an old soul, and just the way that Rónán Hession goes into all that, in a way that doesn't feel like psychological mumble jumble, it just adds to the story. So there's their relationship, and the fact that, well, I think it's the fourth short chapter, just a delight about when Ocho was a young boy. His mother had walked into his room while he was privately discovering himself. I just love that. And there's this very short chapter about all that and sex and stuff, but just perfectly described. But this mountain has appeared, and the other main character is a woman who had been sued for walking across a landowner's field because it was his private property, and she lost the case, and then he died, and she just started walking across his property again with her dog, and ends up walking up the mountain. But something distressing is happening with her dog, I won't say what, so that she doesn't realize that she's walking up a mountain. And it just goes from there, and I don't think I've probably done it justice in the way that I've described it, but it's absolutely enthralling me. So, this one too is just sparkling. All right, so I finished the David Carpenter, so I always pick up another book next immediately to keep reading to Mary Jean, and I'm going to read her a book that I didn't know how I would be able to fit into my 2024 reading year, and she thought it sounded really interesting, so I've actually read the first chapter. I'm not going to give you my preliminary thoughts based on one chapter, other to say that I loved the first chapter, but I'll give a preliminary check-in next week. This is a novel that I talked about in a somewhat recent book haul. Canadian novel, Ivy's Tree by Wendy Burton. And it was published by the local Saskatoon publisher, Thistledown Press, in 2020. And I didn't know it existed until I was browsing the Thistledown Press website. And when I read what it was about, I thought, oh, this is a Sean book. I need to track this down. So I ordered a copy. The author, Wendy Burton, she may have lived in Saskatchewan or Saskatoon before. No, as far as I know from her profile on the Writers Union of Canada website, Wendy Burton has never lived in Saskatchewan, but she just found this publisher to publish this novel. It's her only published work. And she's got several other works that she's working on or that she has available to be published if anybody's interested. And based on just one chapter, I think the publisher should be interested. She taught creative writing and academic stuff, diversity education and whatnot at the University of the Fraser Valley. So that's British Columbia. This novel is about a 77-year-old woman, and I am very partial to works of fiction that have older women as the protagonist. And somehow, I don't know yet how, she ends up in Japan. But the novel opens in Vancouver, and that's all I'm going to say about it. But I'm so excited to be reading this to Mary Jean. I'll have more to say about it next week. So that's the kind of sparkly reading week it's been over here. I hope you've been similarly illuminated by a lot of literary sparkles surrounding you. Thanks for watching.